If you're turning to Galatians, you're going to the wrong spot. Just for you proactive type A'ers who are probably already there, you need to go back a little bit. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 17. 1 Kings chapter 17 this morning. This is an event in history. It's not just a Bible. Sometimes we say story, a Bible story. We feel like it's just a fabricated narrative. This is an event in history that really happened. And yes, it is a Bible story, but it's an event in history as well. This is not a fictional account. This is real life of God preparing Elijah for a future ministry where he really needed to trust and know God's power to prove God over the prevailing opinion of that day, which was trusting in this God called Baal. And so this has been a passage that has strengthened me this week, and I just wanted to speak from it in light of our need to be reminded of God's power. It's fun to be in the midst, at least for me it is. I don't know if it is for you. It's fun to be in the midst of the college football season because I like watching college football, and yes, the Steelers too. And it's interesting how I don't think I've ever met somebody who's not liked an underdog sort of story or a Cinderella story or a rags to riches sort of story where like the no-name team shows up and just obliterates a top-ranked team, whether it's basketball or football, or maybe it's me actually marrying Liz, something like that, an underdog story. In fact, the term underdog didn't come into our language until they say, it's like who invented the internet what am I saying? Liz's hometown, Somerville, is now called like the birthplace of sweet tea. And it's like, I don't know, maybe sweet tea did start there. I don't know, like how can you really validate that, because maybe someone else invented it. But so like underdog, maybe it was used before 1859, but this is when it came into our language that the underdog, like the underrated or the weak dog would actually win the fight, right? And it's not just us who likes these underdog stories of an unexpected thing or a person or team coming through and prevailing and triumphing and winning. God likes that too. In fact, Noah and the ark is kind of an underdog story. This is our perspective on things. This is our opinion. This is our vantage point. It looks like the odds are against him. The whole neighborhood, the whole city, all the people are against him, and yet he's still trusting God and following through with his mission. Joseph is an underdog story. The son who's beaten by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, down in Egypt, and totally unknown he's not even known to be existing by his father, and he becomes the leader who sustains Israel in the midst of famine and prepares them for their exodus, like their upcoming exodus, by keeping them a true nation of people in the midst of that famine that they went through. Moses versus Pharaoh is kind of an underdog story. Ruth and Naomi is kind of an underdog story as they lose all of their lifelines. The husband dies, and the two brothers die, and now they're left on their own, a widow and a widow. That's not good odds, right? That's not a good scenario to be in, and they prevail by God's power and grace. Shamgar with the ox goad kills 600 Philistines. I could keep going, and so I will. Deborah and Jael, the two women in the Judges' history, Jael with the tent peg versus Sisera, an underdog story. Gideon with his 300 men versus the thousands that came against him, and prevailing with God's power. Esther versus Haman is an underdog story. Daniel versus the lions. Every one of these situations, the common denominator is that the situation is outside of their control and their ability. And that's exactly where God wanted them to be. He gets the glory and the praise, and he proves his might and his wisdom and his power by prevailing against the odds that are stacked against his people. And so the same situation exists as we turn to Elijah with what we're going to see here, because what's at stake in the midst of Israel in this part of history is that King Ahab has taken throne, and he has done, as it says about him, he's done more evil than anyone before him. He's taken Jezebel as his wife, a Gentile lady who worships other gods, and he begins worshiping Baal, a false god, as an Israelite leader. Not only is he leading the worship of a false god, but he actually built a church or built a temple for Baal in the capital city of Israel. So he says, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build a church or a temple, and it's not going to be for Yahweh, it's going to be for Baal. And then not only that, but after it's constructed, right in the middle of that temple, he puts an idol of Baal, right in the middle of the church, in the middle of the city, which is signifying, God, you're out of the picture. You're no longer relevant. You're no longer powerful. You're no longer first in command. Now it's Baal. And so God is going to respond through Elijah. Actually, Ahab and other worshipers who are abandoning God, actually, I'm still in control, and I'm still powerful, and I'm still prevailing, and he's going to prove it to them. And that's what Elijah's ministry is, proving the power of God in the midst of a point in time when worship of God is threatened to be extinguished. Elijah's name means Yahweh is God. It's a significant name and a significant ministry at a time when Baal worship threatened to extinguish the worship of Yahweh. Catch this, please. It's a point in time when Baal worship threatened to extinguish the worship of the one true God. And at this point in time, God proves his power and receives the praise against the odds that seem to be stacked against Elijah. The odds seem impossible. That we're going to look at this scenario. When we face the impossible, or when we're in the midst of pain, as Elijah is here, when he's facing the impossible, or when you're facing the impossible, our hearts are at risk. Just like Israel as a nation was at risk. Remember, I said Baal worship threatened to extinguish the worship of Yahweh. When we face the impossible, our hearts are at risk of turning away from God, not trusting God, and our hearts are at risk of not worshiping God in the midst of the impossible, or in the midst of the pain, or in the midst of the trial. I've been battling this all week, yet I feel like God's grace has prevailed in the midst of pain. Last week we were counting down the hours, standing right here saying 16 hours, 15 hours, right? Up to Liz's scheduled induction. But I guess as we've learned, and you know it, I guess you can attempt to count down the hours, but you can't predict what's going to happen, right? You might be able to count down the hours, but you can't predict what's going to happen. So Liberty was admitted to the NICU on Monday afternoon, and what's interesting about this situation is she kept barely passing the tests to avoid the NICU, right? So the nurse who was in there with us said she's got to be above 4 pounds and she doesn't have to go down, and she was just barely above 4 pounds, and we were like, yes! And then she's like, her blood sugar has to come up a little bit, and we're praying in the labor delivery room for her blood sugar to come up, and it comes up, and we say, yes, her blood sugar's up, and then her oxygen, and then it was doing well, and then they took her off, and they were weighing her, and her oxygen was going down. They had to give her some help, and she's like, nope, that's it. She's got to go down. We're like, oh man, we were so disappointed. But what's interesting about God's wisdom is that the reason that they sent her down there wasn't the reason that she needed to be there. They couldn't see it. They couldn't see that her blood platelet count was so low. And so what we were praying for was her to stay with us, but God was saying she needs to be in the care of those doctors down there. And it was actually a comforting fact that he was prevailing over and beyond what we were praying for, because he knew that she needed something different. She needed her platelet count and platelet condition to be taken care of. And so driving home Monday after this transpired, driving home Monday to see the girls and to bring them down back to Pittsburgh, I had a good talk with God and a little bit of a cry, okay? Just a little bit, just a couple tears. You know, guys, we only cry a little bit, right? That's not true. Don't ever believe that. And that was my time to kind of just pray and just kind of call out to the Lord. And this passage came flooding into my heart, and I haven't studied this recently. I've never studied this passage. I don't even remember the last time I read this passage. I don't know if I ever read this passage. No, I know I have, because I usually make it up to this mark with my reading plan, and then I give up, as I've said before. And I said, Lord, and I started to think about the things that were coming against us, like Elijah, like the impossible or the difficulty or the pain coming against him. And I began to think about that. And one of the things, obviously the biggest thing, was liberty, grace's healing. And then on the farther away from that, the smaller end of the spectrum was just like the expense and the time and the travel and all that stuff. And I just started to pray. Lord, don't let our oil run out. And he's like, Geoff, what are you talking about? I'm like, you know what I'm talking about. You wrote this stuff, right? And I was talking about this passage. Lord, don't keep us filled up. Please provide for us. And I was thinking at that point in time when I was praying, I was like, Lord, we need your help going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We need your help just to provide for us what we need for traveling and for whatever else. And I got back down to the hospital, and the first thing the nurse asked was, hey, did you get a gas card? And I said, Lord, thank you. And that was just the spring rain. That was just the foretaste. That was just like the tip of the iceberg. And you guys have flooded support. Prayer, spiritually, emotional, physical support. And it was God keeping our oil jug filled up. And I shared this with Liz. And she was relaying it to, I think, her mom and her sister. And she was like, Geoff's talking about something about an oil in a jug or something. So I want to talk about that this morning. I want to talk about that this morning, how with Elijah and this widow that we're going to see, the odds seem impossible. And they are impossible from a human perspective. They don't have the ability to do and to exceed what's coming against them, but God does. And that's what Elijah needs to learn. And that's what I need to learn. And that's what you need to learn, that God has the power to prevail when the odds are against us, whatever those might look like. You might know where you need to be filled up this morning. You might be like, yes, finally, my dad is hearing the sermon he needs to hear. Or you might not know where you need to be filled up. Maybe it hasn't come against you yet. But we always need to be reminded that God has the prevailing power and grace and goodness. God's power in the impossible flooded my heart. And there's proof of God's power here in 1 Kings chapter 17, which has been my anchor this week, the thing that I've been praying about in diving into and digesting spiritually as we've gone through the week. And I want to bring you hope and encouragement for where you're at with this passage. And what's interesting about 1 Kings chapter 17 is that the impossible scenarios that Elijah is coming against are testing his faith in order to prepare him for a future ministry. We love that story, and lots of popular Bible people have these like their mountaintop sort of experiences, or like their trademark moment in time. Whatever that, however you say that, you guys can translate that. Elijah's moment is on Mount Carmel, right? When he's on Mount Carmel, and he sets up the idols. Or what am I talking about? He sets up the altar. He sets up the altar to Yahweh, and the Baal worshippers set up their altar to Baal, and their God doesn't exist, and so their altar isn't consumed, right? And then Elijah says, Lord, do this so that they may know that you are God. And fire comes down, and it consumes the altar, and it licks up the water in the trough around it, and it proves his power. But before that, God has to prepare Elijah's heart. And that's what he's doing here. He's preparing his heart by testing his faith. And I feel like that's when we come up against impossible things as a child of God, it's testing and strengthening our heart to prepare us to continue to walk with God. And so here we go in 1 Kings chapter 17. I want us to see this, and we're going to skip that whole underdog thing. Babies and dogs always get the "aw," don't they? It'll shorten the sermon a little bit. Yay, okay. I don't get that. So, but here we go. I want to show you, people have been asking some pictures. Here's Liberty Grace. Here's Liberty. She's very peaceful and content. She's doing well, and in all ways, just they're trying to figure out her platelet count difficulty. And there's Mom and Liberty there, and there's Dad and Liberty. First selfie. That's her first selfie. And then this last one. So there she is. I want to show you guys that. So impossibility is God's opportunity to prove his power. And that's what he's doing with Elijah. And what's interesting about this episode in Elijah's life is that it's not coincidence. It's not coincidental. You're going to see it. He's going to say, a drought is coming, Elijah, and go tell King Ahab about this. It's not coincidence. It's God's providence declaring what's going to happen. And so, impossibility is God's opportunity to prove his power. And when he proves his power, he strengthens our faith. When we are seeing God come through like he has been for us this week, or like he has in your life, and how he will in your life, when he proves his power, he strengthens your faith to keep walking with him, to keep demonstrating his goodness through your life. So let's take a look at how God proves his power in the life of Elijah here. So first of all, Elijah was a Tishbite in Gilead, and he says to the king, remember the king? He doesn't care about God, Yahweh, he cares about Baal. And so he says to Ahab, as the Lord, the one that you forgot about and don't care about, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. So God says, it's by my word that rain falls. It's by my word that rain dries up. And what's ironic about this is Baal was the god of rain, the fertility god who gave rain, and he gave growth, and he gave life. So God is saying, Ahab, it's not your God who oversees these things and has the prerogative over these things and commands and directs these things. It's me. God is saying, Ahab, I'm the God over these things. Now watch it happen. This is what he's going to do. He's proving his power because he wants Israel's heart to turn back to him. They're turning away from him, and they're latching on to an empty, false hope of Baal. They're turning away from him, and it's hurting God's heart. It hurts God's heart when we turn away from him. And God is showing his steadfast love and his loyal love by showing up and saying, listen, the drought's coming, and it's going to prove that Baal doesn't exist. This drought is going to prove that I exist. I'm the living God. You see it? This is not accidental that he says that the living God, because Baal is a dead God. And he's saying, I want to prove my power over these things, over the realm of activity that you think your God orchestrates. It's Yahweh, the true God. And so this is Elijah's mission, okay, to bring this message, drought's coming, and then duck and hide because King Ahab is probably going to start trying to grab hold of Elijah for speaking such words. And so now this is the message, right? But Elijah's heart still needs to be prepared and strengthened for the ministry that he has to prove God's power. And so here, this is the first test that Elijah comes against, right here. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan." He's probably thinking, no problem, I'm going to go hide because I just delivered the worst case scenario to our king, right? A drought is coming. And so he's going to hide. And he says, "You will drink from the brook. I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Okay, God, you're telling me to deliver this ominous message, a drought's coming, dear king. And now you're telling me to run and hide and drink from a brook, and the brooks are probably the first water source to dry up because they're dependent on the rain and the runoff and all that. So, God, this isn't going to last very long, this whole water and raven thing. And he's going to prove to Elijah that he has the power to provide. Look, remember how I said God loves an underdog story? He chooses the raven to feed Elijah. You know what the raven does? The raven gives birth and leaves the young. They don't even care about their own. It even says that in Job. He says when the young are looking for food because their parents have left, the young raven's looking for food because the parent raven has left them, you provide for the young raven, because the ravens are neglectful, they're careless, they don't even care about their own offspring. And he's saying, I'm going to choose the bird that even neglects his own from feeding it, and I'm going to feed you with that source. So it's not going to be like, a good caretaker sort of bird. This is like probably one of the worst examples that there could be to prove to Elijah that God has the power. And what does he say? I have commanded this to happen. It's not coincidence, it's not accident, it's not serendipitous, it's God's commanding power. So he went, and so here it is. A test of faith always needs a response of trust. A test of faith, right here, requires a response of trust. That's how our faith gets built. God, you're leading me in this. This is before me, and I want to trust you and walk through it. Or I want to trust you and open and say it. Or I'm going to trust you in withdrawal and not. A test of faith requires a response of trust. And so here's Elijah. His faith is getting strengthened as he goes. It says, so he went. And that's going to be repeated later. So he went. So he went. With each little step of trust, his faith is strengthened. So he went and he did according to the word of the Lord. Okay, but where are the ravens, God? Where are these food-bearing ravens that you promised? He went and he lived by the brook that is east of the Jordan. Remember, I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. And the ravens bring him bread, and they bring him meat. Bonus, meat-bringing ravens, right? The ravens bring him bread, not just the bare minimum, which is really, really neat. Not just the bare minimum, which would have been enough, just bread and water, but also meat, like real, substantial sustenance in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening. And he drank from the brook. I mean, can you imagine Elijah's faith? Like if faith was a muscle, you see it kind of growing. The raven, caw, caw, or whatever sound they make in the morning, and whatever they do, I don't know if they drop it in like a McDonald's bag or whatever, how they deliver it. Like, did you order the number one? I don't know. But it gets delivered in the morning and he eats and it's, Lord, thank you. You came through. You did what you said. And then in the evening, stomach is starting to growl and rumble. Well, mine growls every 2 hours, so I don't know what his was like. But then the evening again, God, you provided again. His faith muscle, his trust is strengthening as God is providing and prevailing over the impossible. And that's to prepare him for what's next. Well, what's next? Then the word of the Lord came Because why? After a while, the brook dried up. Now what? Now what? Is God going to keep seeing me through this? Yeah, he is. Look, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Now arise and go to Zarephath, which is a Gentile area. So leave kind of like your hometown. You're getting farther and farther and farther away from home, which is uncomfortable. He says, go to Sidon and dwell there. Why? What are you doing, God? What are you doing? We have these questions. What are you doing? What is going on? But he has to trust to find out what God's doing, right? I rehearse that with our daughter, like, God, why are you sending her to the NICU? What is going on? And then they find out that she has this need of attention with her platelets. Oh, okay. And so Elijah has to trust that what God is asking him to do here is in his favor and not in his harm or jeopardy or whatever the opposite of that is. Why, God? I've commanded. Remember? He says, I've commanded a widow there to feed you. Okay? You've commanded a raven, and now you've commanded a widow. Okay? When there's a famine, a widow would be the worst place to go for food. You don't want to take her food because she doesn't have a husband out there gathering food for her. Right? So that would be an impossible situation or a difficult situation. He's saying, I'm going to provide through an unlikely source, just like an unlikely source with the raven. Now a widow is an unlikely source. He doesn't say go to the richest person in the town, or go to the person who has the most stored, go to the person who's the most prepared. He says go to a widow, and we're going to find out that this widow is not just any widow. She's at the last of her supply. She has nothing left except enough flour and enough oil to make one last piece of bread or one last meal of bread, and then they're done. He says, but I've commanded a widow there to feed you. And so he arose and he went. Again, a test of faith requires a response of trust, right? God tells him to go to the brook, and he says, regardless of the questions, the prevailing response is, I'm going to trust you, Lord, and I'm going to walk towards that brook, and I'm going to wait for those ravens. And here again we see it as Elijah's faith is growing in preparation for his life and ministry as ours is. He arose and he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, there was a widow there. Okay, I see your plan beginning to unfold, Lord. There's a widow there, and she's gathering sticks. And he called to her and he said, can you bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink? I think he's trying to see if this is the right person. Can you bring me a little bit of water? And she says, again, I wanted to show you this, that this is repeated intentionally, that God's saying, I've commanded a widow to do this. And what's interesting about this is that the widow is unaware of this. The widow is unaware of how God is going to be presenting an opportunity before her as a Gentile to learn and to continue to trust Yahweh, the God of Israel and the God of the universe, to come to a greater faith in him, even as a non-Jew. He's saying, I've commanded her, and so he arose and he went. And as she was going to bring it, Elijah must think at this point, okay, this is the one. To us, we're thinking this is the unlucky one who gets her last meal taken away because she has nothing left, and this guy shows up and he's asking for it, but this is actually an opportunity for her faith to be strengthened as well. And so now Elijah says, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. So just a little bit of water and just a little bit of bread. Isn't that interesting that God tells Elijah to go and ask her for food, and he's like, can I have a little bit of water and a little bit of bread? God's saying, I commanded her to feed you. Okay, does that constitute a meal to anybody? Like if God says, I'm going to feed you, and Elijah says, just a little water and a morsel of bread, I think it's showing the humanity here that he's a little bit nervous about this. He doesn't say, give me all you have because God said so. He still needs his faith to be strengthened, right? So he's saying, just a little bit, please. a little bit of water, a little bit of bread. And she can't even give that. So she says, as the Lord your God lives. So she's recognizing God is in control here to whatever degree of faith that is. She has a faith that he exists and that he's living God. She says, I have nothing baked. I have nothing. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. A handful of flour. Picture like a cup of flour and like a couple tablespoons of olive oil. She's like, this is my last. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and for my son. Oh, and she has a son too. Oh, you didn't tell me that, God. Can I go to a different widow? Like, this is their last meal. And you're asking me? And he's like, no, I'm not asking you to take away. I'm going to fill her up. And I'm going to fill you up. And you're going to experience my power here. Look, we're going to eat this and we're going to die. This is the last thing we have. There's a famine all around us. We have no supply. We have no provision. This is the last of it. So this is her objection. And this is my objection. Lord, I can't handle this. I can't do this. You can't fill in your own situation for an objection against what God maybe is orchestrating or preparing us to walk through. This is what she says, and then Elijah says, don't fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and for your son. What's interesting, at least with my personality and where my faith still needs to be strengthened, is sometimes like Elijah, sometimes I'm presenting a difficulty like this week, and it's like, God, I'm trusting you, but I still need to maneuver and orchestrate and plan and of what I need to do in case like you miss something or in case you don't really show up at the time that I think you should show up, right? Okay, it's just me. It's not apparently not you. No. Right? We begin to feel like we give God like 90% control, and it's like, God, I'll take care of the 10. Like your hands are on the wheel, but mine's right there too, like this way sort of thing, kind of like how maybe you drive your husband's car when he's trying to drive, maybe. Bad example, I'm sorry. That was not scripted. But like Elijah, when he said, can I have just a little bit? I wonder if that was him exercising or expressing an area of trust where he's still weak. Like this past week, they had Liberty on IV fluids because they wanted to make sure that the digestion process wasn't pulling strength from an area where she needed it for like her platelet count or something else that they weren't sure of yet. But me, I was like, she needs to be eating. She needs to be eating. She needs to be eating. Obviously, that's all I think about, right? And so I'm told Liz about this, and I didn't want to keep burdening her. I was getting like focused in on this one thing, and it wasn't good. So I called her dad and talked to him about it, and I talked to her mom about it a little bit, and then I began to battle. This was like, I think it was Wednesday. I was flipping some laundry downstairs, and I began to think about this. Lord, she needs to be eating. He's like, you need to trust me. She needs to be eating. You need to trust me. You need to trust that I'm working through the doctors. And we're downstairs, and Liz has no idea who I'm talking to. Actually, I was talking in my heart and mind. And I began to feel like nervous. Like, okay, this is what I need to say to the doctors. This is going to be my argument. I'm going to just give you the real honest picture. Should I wear something more professional so I look like more believable or credible? Like, I'm serious. I had thought this way. And I was like, no, Geoff, don't worry about that. Calm down. I actually started to get a little bit anxious. Like, this is what I need to say. Like, this, I think she needs to be eating. And I was like, just calm down. And I began to pray. Lord, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you with this. You know what you're doing. I'm not going to ask just for a little morsel and a little water. I'm not going to try to maneuver. I'm going to just let go of it and just trust you. And we showed up. And they said, hey, she began eating today. She just took her first bottle, and it was great. And I thought, oh, wow, what a blessing. But it was indicative of the fact that at times we're walking forward through something and we're trusting God fully until there's a point where we feel like it's not happening in our time frame or not happening in the way that we think it should be done, so we can begin to assert our opinion on it instead of just simply trusting and surrendering that. Keep talking to God about it. Keep giving it to Him. Don't pretend like it doesn't exist because it's there, but say, God, this is where I'm nervous. This is where I don't understand. This is where I'm confused. Keep trusting Him with it, that He's going to provide what's necessary to see you through that. And so, look, the widow, remember, she said, but this is what I'm saying. And then Elijah comes back and he says, but this is what God's saying. That jar that you talked about, and that jug you talked about, let's talk about that. The Lord says the jar of flour is not going to be spent. And the jug of oil is not going to be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. So Elijah comes back against her honest objection. He's saying, God's not going to leave you empty. God's not going to leave you high and dry. He wants to strengthen your faith, and He wants to see you through this if you'll trust in Him. And that's what I have to constantly tell myself right now, and I know for you as well, that we need to constantly tell ourselves that. God's not going to leave you empty. And I'm not saying that with a phony, fake expression, like I believe that, but yet I need to keep believing that. You know? It's like I said earlier, we have to keep reminding ourselves of God's goodness. Elijah's telling her, God's not going to leave you empty. He's not going to take your flour and your oil and to leave you with nothing. Here, He's going to provide for you what you need to do what He's asking you to do. That's what's happening here. God is going to provide for what you need to do what He's asking you to do. Remember, He kept saying, I commanded the ravens, I commanded the widow to do this. What God commands to happen, He's going to complete. What God commands to happen, He's going to complete. What our part in that is to take those steps of trust. And I'm not saying that I'm doing that, but I want to be reminded of that. And I want you to pray for us that we do that we trust God and keep relying upon His power and His goodness. And we want to know what you're going through, to be calling out to God for you to have that heart and for that to take those steps of trust. And so we're wondering what happens to this widow and what happens to Elijah. So she went and she did. Same thing, remember? Elijah, go to the brook, ravens are going to feed you. So he went and he did. Elijah, go to the widow in Zarephath. So he went and he did. Dear widow, go and make bread and feed Elijah. So she went and she did. So a test of faith requires a response of trust. Do you think that was I know this is way rhetorical. Do you think that was easy for her? No. This was her last resort, right? Remember, she said, this is our final meal. So get out of here, dude, whoever you are and from wherever you've come. This is our last meal. And he says, no, it's not your last meal. You're not going to be left empty. And so she takes that promise of God's prevailing power, and it leads her to take that step of faith. Okay, I'm going to go bake this. She pours the last of the flour down on maybe a flat stone, and she takes the last of the oil and pours it on the stone, and she takes a little bit of water, and she begins to knead it. And I wonder, is she thinking, is this my last meal or not? Is God going to come through or not? I mean, there's nothing left here. I wonder, it takes a while to knead bread, right? So I wonder if she's struggling. So I just keep this for me and my son? Or do I trust and serve it to God's person here? And so it says she went and she did, and she and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord. I know this might sound, I run the risk of being, I almost said Uber, sorry. I run the risk of sounding super cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyways. I don't know what your jar of flour is, and I don't know what your jug of oil is, but when you're trusting God, it's not going to be empty to do what He's calling you to do. It might be some emotion that you need to continue to go through something that He's asking you or calling you to go through. It might be finances, where you're at, a situation you're going through, a medical condition, a surgery or a procedure or operation. You're like, Lord, we really need your help. I believe that He's not just going to ask you to do something and leave you empty. I'm not saying, this is not prosperity gospel here. I'm not saying that He's going to boost your bank account and boost your retirement and boost your portfolio and boost your possessions. I'm saying He's going to provide for you to do what you need to do with His prevailing grace. Jesus said, the thief, who is Satan, the evil one, the thief comes to steal and to kill and to destroy, but I have come that you have life and may have it abundantly, right? And He's not talking about financial and material. He's talking about spiritual, trusting God to see us through what He's calling us to walk through. And it's my job and it's your job to take that step of trust when we have that test of faith. To take that step of trust when we have that test of faith. And that's hard, and that's why we need each other. That's why we need prayer. That's why we need spouses and friends pouring into our life, supporting us, encouraging us, just like you guys have done with us. I told Brian, my brother, I said, this is the only time in my life, I have a little plaque in my office. It says, Isaiah 40:31, those who wait on the Lord, which is hope and trust in Him, those who wait on the Lord shall gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will walk and not grow tired. They will run and not grow weary. I said, this is the first time in my life that I have felt that to be true. I have literally felt in a spiritual way that God has carried, I can speak for myself and also for Liz, carried us through a very difficult week. And that comes from the support that we are surrounded by, like with this. What aspect of your life or a test or difficulty where you feel like your jar is getting empty or your jug is being spent, where you maybe need God? Please fill me up, encourage me here, strengthen my faith to keep walking through this. Don't isolate yourself. If you have something going on where you need support or encouragement, open up to somebody so you can gain that. Maybe that might be a way of God coming through and providing for you. To be a type of person who becomes a little bit more vulnerable to open up with something that you might need help or encouragement with. Or maybe you're aware of something and you're like me and you're not the most empathetic or understanding of people. Maybe like me, how I need to at times is kind of like put myself in their shoes of what might that person need right now with what they're going through. How might I be used of God to encourage them, to kind of fill up their jar or fill up their jug, to God keep seeing them through a very difficult time in their life, or give them that encouragement to take that step of faith. When you're in the midst of that, take that step of faith when you have that test of faith going on. The jar of flour was not spent. The jug of oil became empty. So God completed what He commanded, right? Commanded the ravens and He fed Elijah. He commanded the widow and He fed Elijah. And I realize the story goes on and the widow's son dies. And I should quickly finish that because you're like, what? The son died? I thought she trusted God. And what happened? Well, her son died and she says, what in the world's going on, Elijah? And he says, basically, I don't know. He says, give me your son. And he starts praying over his son. He says 3 times he prayed over his son for God's power to come through. And remember, God is proving His power here. Remember who the fertility God is here in Israel that's trying to take His seat of position as central in the nation? Baal. And so God has now provided the rain to stop. He's provided the ravens to feed. And He's provided the jar of flour and the jug of oil to not grow empty. So who is the God who provides. He's saying, it's me. And now the son has died. Now the son has died. And Elijah's, I'm sure he's recalling, God, you brought the ravens. God, the jug's not empty and the jar's not empty. God, he says, he's 3 times, he prays over this child. He says, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourned by killing her son?" He says, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." It says 3 times he pleads for God to rescue and revive this dead child, and the child's life comes back to him. And God demonstrates that he's the God and the provider for life, not this Baal conception that's beginning to take root in the nation. He's saying, it's me who has power even over death. This is the first time in Israel's history where somebody is revived again or resurrected. And this, remember, is all preparing Elijah for what he has no idea about yet, which is the Mount Carmel showdown, right? Where he calls out to God in faith, and it's recorded in the book of James that Elijah is a man of prevailing power or prevailing prayer. And it's because God is testing and strengthening his faith through these tests. I have no idea why we're going through what we're going through, or Liberty, or our daughters, or our family. I have no idea why you might be going through what you're going through. But I know for Elijah, it had a purpose of strengthening his faith for something in the future. And I know for us, and I know for you, that what you're going through is meant to strengthen your faith for something in the future. And right now, our job is to trust God's prevailing power and take those steps of faith, even in the midst of the test of faith.